there's a huge risk for you, the MarTech leader, because there's a bunch of people out there, including the legacy industry analyst firms, that typically lag in their vendor assessments and can give the stamp of good health to an otherwise sick and declining player.
Welcome to Real Story on MarTech. Ruthless advocates for your MarTech mission. Advising buyers with just the facts on stacks to get you on the right track.
Welcome back to the Real Story on MarTech. I'm Jarrod, Gingras, Managing Director of the Real Story Group.
I'm Tony Byrne, founder of Real Story Group.
Now, Tony, here in New England, there's a crisp in the air. It's officially October. That means we're in Halloween season, and I'm going to put my hand up. You wanted to dress up today, but I kind of shot that down. I'm not really a dress-up guy, not really a costume guy, but today's topic is a Halloween theme. Is your vendor a zombie?
Yeah, it's suitable for Halloween because it's truly a scary topic, Jarrod. But honestly, the phenomenon of zombie vendors happens all year round.
Yeah, and indeed, like Halloween, sometimes the fear is real, but sometimes not.
For sure. So let's get into it.
All right, Tony, let's start at the beginning. What's a MarTech vendor zombie?
Well, the concept actually goes way back to the first .com bubble. When the bubble burst, Forbes magazine published a really famous article, I don't know, sometime around 2002, and the piece was titled The Undead. And this article profiled some struggling enterprise software vendors who were nevertheless sitting on a large pile of cash. And that was because they IPO'd, raising all this money at these pumped up valuations just before the 2001 crash. Now, most of them did end up burning through the rest of their cash and getting sold off, though it took a while for some of them to pass on to what we'll call it the great beyond. And so Forbes called them the undead.
Right. So in the meantime they were just effectively zombies.
Exactly. And they weren't going to die right away, but they couldn't really generate meaningful revenues, let alone profits. You know, honestly, it became something of a joke.
Except it probably wasn't that funny for their customers, I'd imagine, right? I remember one vendor, for some of the old timers on the podcast today might remember the name Vignette. They were definitely one of those Forbes undead vendors, and for their customers, I think we all saw that the next several years were pretty terrifying.
Yeah, true that.
So just to be clear, though, it's not like we're sitting here declaring another tech bubble, though. You know, it's possible that when you look at today's vendor valuations, especially around AI and pretty much everything else today, maybe that's coming. But but at Real Story Group, I just want to say we do see quite a few zombie vendors today. You know, vendors that are just not quite dead yet, but not fully alive either. So this is a message for all of you as tech customers out there, whether you're a MarTech or digital leaders, you just want to be on alert for zombies in your portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, a quarter century later, there's a whole new generation of undead tools and vendors. This time, of course, is a little bit different. This time, it's more that are coasting on legacy venture capital investments. And I think there's a decent crop of MarTech vendors who have aged to a point where they're just kind of in subsistence mode, and they're just essentially moving along like a zombie.
Yeah, you mentioned tracking this for the last couple decades, and but it seems like today there's a couple different twists to this. You know, the first type of zombie is, as you say, moving along on a kind of a legacy inertia, right? They have this profitable maintenance streams, you know, usually supporting some legacy systems and environments that, you know, the customers just can't easily switch out, so you're kind of stuck with them. Some email marketing, web content management vendors certainly come to mind. And what these zombies tend to do is they keep costs to a minimum, especially their R&D costs. So they're not exactly dead, but you wouldn't actually call them living either.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely see a lot of older vendors that fit that mold. But there's a second type of zombie that's a younger victim haunting the marketplace. So they have SaaS, software as a service based models, where what they essentially do is kind of marginalize their expenses relative to revenues. So if they start having fewer customers, it might not be a totally deadly problem, because it's mostly just that their Amazon bill starts to go down. So they can keep, marching on and almost create the impression that they're fully alive.
Yeah, this reminds me of the zombie movies, right? But there's a big difference from the movies, right? In the movies, the zombies often give the appearances that they're dead when they're actually alive. In this case, what we're seeing is some of these zombies are giving all the appearances that they're alive, but they're nearly dead. So there's a huge risk for you, the MarTech leader, because there's a bunch of people out there, including the legacy industry analyst firms, that typically lag in their vendor assessments and can give the stamp of good health to an otherwise sick and declining player.
Yeah, I mean, what immediately comes to mind is, several years ago, the Oracle and the IBM MarTech suites definitely getting praised, way, way, way beyond their prime. And we saw big companies buying them because Forrester and Gartner kept putting them in the top right quadrant. And I suspect those analyst firms are repeating that same mistake with Adobe and Salesforce today.
Yeah, but you do like to talk about another very specific zombie vendor, isn't that right?
Jarrod, you know me well. That zombie would be another vendor that was actually on the original Forbes list, and it's a tech firm called Interwoven. You know them, Jarrod, because of the two digital asset management or DAM platforms that they acquired and sold. I know them as one of the oldest CMS vendors. Interwoven was perhaps the worst example of analyst firm, I'll call it analyst firm zombie pumping, right? So Forrester and Gartner, they lauded Interwoven products for more than a decade past their prime. But the thing is, in the meantime, their licensees were totally struggling under mountains of technical debt.
Yeah, we personally know many people who suffered through those platforms, and some of them are still suffering today. Let's do a little thinking back to some history here, Tony. Remember during the 2010s, we put out a public call for a single happy Interwoven customer, and we did this every single year. We put out that call. Just pop your head up and tell us you're happy with this vendor. And we never got a single response from an Interwoven licensee that said they were happy.
Yeah, and Interwoven's still not dead yet. I mean, most of the Interwoven portfolio is still wheezing away at OpenText, which is its fourth hideout in 12, 15 years.
All right. Well, that was some good name dropping there, kind of a blast from the past for some of the listeners. But I'm sure there's more to come when we're going to mention some more names in this podcast. But first, let's say I'm a MarTech or digital stack leader, right? And aside from them, maybe aside from the different zombie vendors being really ugly, maybe tell me more about what's so scary about having one of these zombie vendors in my platforms or in my stack.
Yeah, well, of course we can overstate this because the reality is most MarTech vendors aren't actually lethal and are very unlikely to eat up the rest of your stack. However, if you leave them unaddressed, they can create a major drain on your time and resources and a major drain on your staff morale too.
Yeah, I feel like staff morale is really a big deal here. People don't like working on a system that they have to fight with or keep caged or whatever. It's not just developers or other techies either. Marketing people, we hear it all the time, already face a lot of frustration with the speed and demands of their jobs, and they have to work around a platform that's effectively missing arms and legs. That's a problem, right? So they start to think, my enterprise doesn't care about me, or my enterprise simply doesn't prioritize marketing.
And the very best people will consider leaving, and a lot of good performers may stay on only because they have to, not because they want to. And then in the meantime, the rest of your staff is really struggling and not focusing on what they should be. And I think there's a story, kind of a larger story here from our tech leaders, is that a zombie in your stack can slow down everything else. So for the MarTech leader, you've probably had this experience where it sucks up your time and attention. Bugs go unresolved, and that holds up important workloads. Older integration models force all kind of workarounds. At some point, you can say, yeah, I'm glad the vendor didn't actually go kaput, but maybe it's almost if they actually really did go kaput, because this zombie is actually kind of killing me. I mean, hell, this vendor is turning me into a zombie, right? So.
Yeah, we've seen that time and time again. All right, let's switch gears slightly here, Tony. Earlier you made a reference to the big Canadian vendor OpenText. I'm sure everyone's heard of OpenText, and I think that brings up another interesting topic. So what happens to zombies when they're not alive, they're not dead? Where do they go?
Sure. Let's talk about OpenText as an example for a minute. OpenText is, how should I put this, a kind of an interesting vendor. I mean, the best way to think about OpenText is that it's kind of a multi-tiered senior community for aging software platforms, right? So they purchase older solutions, set them up with independent apartments, for independent living, and then OpenText transitions those platforms through all the usual phases. In other words, they take that platform from independent living to assisted living to hospice care, and then onto what the vendors, quaintly call sunsetting.
Yeah, I know we mentioned OpenText here, and they're a big big player in this model, but they're not alone here, right? This business model has become quite popular in the past decade or so. So now you see players, the likes of Byrne or an Upland in the marketing tech and customer experience space. Typically these roll-up vendors purchase these zombie tool sets on the cheap, cobble them together into these solution bundles, if you will. And their trick is to limit future development to minimal bug fixes and centralize all the back office functions to reduce costs. And then, of course, they layer on top things like AI to give them kind of a veneer or pretense of active life.
Yeah, which kind of answers the questions that I'm pretty sure is bubbling up in our listeners' minds, which is who actually benefits from this type of senior zombies? And well, the answer is that model can be great for investors who can reap major profits before the zombies actually turn to dust.
Well, Tony, that's kind of a cynical view there, but in many cases, the technology customer can benefit as well, right? Any high functioning community needs to deal with aging members. Same with technology, and this is a way to keep some platforms alive and at least vaguely supported while you look for replacement alternatives.
Sure, just as long as you understand that, despite what a sales rep may tell you, the acquired zombie platform, it's not going to innovate substantially, number one. And number two, that zombie will increasingly struggle to integrate with the newer parts of your stack. So at best, you sustain decent support. And yeah, for sure, that can be worth something.
All right, so not all zombies are going to go to the old age homes. Some, shall we say, age in place. Like if you think about the IBM marketing technology portfolio, which is now kind of wheezing away at acoustic and HCL.
Yeah, or Sitecore's flagship experience platform, web content management system, which has been given a 3-year prognosis, maybe a 5-year prognosis. We could list a dozen more. The bottom line is for a MarTech leader, these are platforms that you ultimately leave, not that you ever license afresh for your stack. But Jarrod, we've been talking so far really about older vendors, but there are younger vendors, younger zombies out there too, right? Just like in the movies.
Oh yeah, they're out there. Thing of it is, sometimes their structural problems get hidden, a little bit better hidden behind all the venture capital that they've received or other funding that they've received. And obviously, this is a huge risk today with a lot of niche AI vendors that we're seeing.
Yeah, so it is similar in that respect to the first .com boom. But Jarrod, if younger vendors can get, I'll say, bitten and infected, how can a digital or MarTech leader tell that this player in the market has actually become a zombie? I mean, it's not like their account executives start dropping limbs and drooling or anything. At least I hope not.
Not yet, but there are some tried and true, surefire, telltale signs. And let's go through a couple of those. So some of those signs that we've seen is, number one, declining volumes of new licenses, right? This is a killer for any younger to middle-aged vendor. You can start to see this at their user group conferences in particular. And maybe even worse, number two, is they stop holding user conferences altogether, or even customer web meetings. They start discontinuing those. That's definitely a bad sign. Number three, I'll say reduced headcount, maybe an obvious one, but not the sort of episodic reorg that we tend to see, but headcount reductions that really cut to the bone, especially when it affects product development. And finally, you need to look at the higher than average churn rates. That's a killer for any B2B supplier. You might expect a software vendor to lose, maybe 1 in every 10, 1 in every 20 licensees each year. But if it's more than that, it signals some certain trouble on the horizon.
Yeah, and this can happen even in really active, otherwise quite vibrant marketplaces. So I'm thinking in particular of the customer data platform or CDP market, where Real Story Group evaluates, more than 24 platforms. Some vendors have plateaued or worse. Started several years ago when that old age home vendor Upland, they acquired CDP vendor BlueVend, and now is kind of on its way through the progression. I think it's in hospice now. Then Lytix CDP got sold to a smallish headless CMS vendor for what was likely a pittance after most of the staff had gotten ripped off. Action IQ was merged with another venture portfolio vendor. mParticle was acquired. And of course, there's more across the entire MarTech landscape. I mean, almost the way the entire journey orchestration engine market got infected and essentially, put away into zombie quarantine at other firms who snapped them up. So, this happened, I want to say, over the course of just 1 year.
That said, it's important to remember that zombie vendors, almost by definition, don't tend to disappear entirely, right? So as you say, they can wander around aimlessly, or as you say, go into some sort of quarantine at another firm, maybe even a roll-up like we've described. But for you, the MarTech and Digital Leader, that gives you time that's typically measured in years, hopefully, to adapt and respond.
Okay, so yeah, let's talk about that, like what stack leaders should do. I mean, it sounds like when you identify a zombie in your stack, you typically don't need to rush to the exits, right?
No, but you do need a replacement plan for the mid or long run. One key consideration is where that particular solution fits in what we tend to call here at Real Story Group the legless stack, right? We mentioned this in a earlier podcast episode on the fact that the future of the MarTech architecture is going to be legless. So it depends on where the vendor or solution fits in that stack. Is it at the edge or is it at the core? So if it's a boutique engagement solution like a chatbot or a social engagement platform at the edge, well then, perhaps adequate support from the vendor is all you need right now while you focus on MarTech innovation on more vibrant platforms. So you don't necessarily need to kill off the zombie, at least not right away.
Yeah, but on the other hand, for an anchor platform that's in your foundation layer, what we call the customer foundation layer, you'll want to make active plans to replace any zombie. And under no circumstance should you ever license a zombie platform afresh for like a new implementation at that core tier in your stack.
That's right. And remember, kids, that a SaaS-based solution doesn't always mean it's modern. And likewise, the breadth of the customer base does not always equal satisfaction among the customer base.
That's so true. And in particular, if we do a little forward gazing, I mentioned earlier today that Adobe and Salesforce could become tomorrow's IBM and Oracle. Now our listeners might not think of Adobe and Salesforce as zombie vendors, but some of their solutions have been, let's just say, looking kind of mealy for some time now. So you always want to do diligence at the platform level and not just the vendor level. And of course, Real Story Group can help you there.
Yeah, which reminds me to remind our listeners, if your enterprise could benefit from an enterprise overall stack health assessment, looking for those zombies, just find any of us at the Real Story Group, and we'd be happy to have a quick checkup call with you. And among other things, we'll signal where we see the zombies existing or emerging in your stack.
Yeah. Meanwhile, for our listeners, we'd love to hear about your experience. We always welcome seeing and hearing your comments and feedback about how you've addressed zombies running amok in your stack.
And of course, as always, we invite you to subscribe to this podcast, share it with a friend, and tell us what you think.
Right. So next up for November, we're going to be talking about kind of a different kind of topic for us, Jarrod. For those of us who know Real Story Group as tough critics, we're going to discuss things in MarTech that we're thankful for.
Yeah, hopefully it's a little bit more positive tone than today. We talked a lot about the scary side of MarTech and things we're afraid of, but hopefully next time you all leave with a list of things that we're thankful for in this space, and we look forward to talking with you then. But in the meantime, happy Halloween, everyone. Enjoy the month, and we'll talk to you in November.
Bye now.